What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 12 of season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. In today's episode, we are talking about the democratic deficit, focusing on trust and the concept of stealth democracy. First up, I talked to Professor Gerry Stoker about his research into trust and democracy, as well as the concept of stealth democracy. Gerry is Professor of Governance within Social Sciences, Politics and International Relations at the University of Southampton. He is also the Centenary Professor of Governance in the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. Professor Stoker's main research interests are in governance, democratic politics, local and regional governance, urban politics, public participation, and public service reform. He's authored or edited over 20 books and published over 70 refereed articles or chapters in books. Thanks so much for joining me today, Gerry. You've done a lot of research looking at how people think about democracy, and a lot of academics and commentators at the moment talk about a democratic deficit. Based on your research, does this exist, and if so, what exactly is it?
I think that it undoubtedly exists, and perhaps has become even more obvious over the last decade. I first started to write about this as a significant issue, I think, about 10, 12 years ago, and my first effort to really cover the thing in detail was a book called Why Politics Matters, which covered the growing disenchantment across a whole range of contemporary democracies. So what's the evidence for the democratic deficit? Well, in some instances, it's definitely a large shift in attitudinal positions in relation to the way in which politicians behave, the way that politics works, the idea that you can actually make a difference through politics. Those have all gone south, negative in the last decade or so. And then I think there's some behavioural attitudes as well in terms of in those countries where people can't vote or can abstain or vote in different ways or vote for non-mainstream parties. I think that's also been evident to people's unwillingness to use mainstream political instruments. I think there's some evidence that that's declined too. And then finally, I think most amazingly over the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen an even more noticeable rise of populist parties that have been trying to exploit that sense of alienation and disenchantment. We've seen populism as a significant factor in the Brexit vote in Britain, in the Trump election in the United States, and in large parts of the politics of Europe, and perhaps reflected in the position of Pauline Hanson and her party within Australia.
Yes, it's certainly populism does seem to be on the rise. To what extent do you think the democratic deficit is a result of a mismatch between what citizens and politicians understand about how democracy should work and I guess their respective roles in democracy?
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. I think the more classic way of putting it that I've used on several occasions is that there may be that this change in attitudes reflects two things. One is some changes on the demand side, which is, well, what the citizens expect from democracy. And there is some evidence that perhaps with a more educated population, with the decline of deference in our culture, maybe with the rise of identity politics as well, that the mainstream political parties and the mainstream political system has actually struggled to deal with that effectively. But I would actually put most of the onus on a change on the supply side, which is, I think, the quality of politics that's being on offer. And I think it's a combination of political parties becoming more professionalized and determined to use the media to present a range of sound bites, a marketing style of offering politics to people, which is kind of, I think, really dumbed down the democratic offer to people. And I think people are just sick to death of that kind of yaboo, stupid politics. So I think some of it is that maybe citizens expect a little bit more, but actually I think it's primarily down to the fact that over the last 2 decades, politicians have changed their patterns of behaviour in order, they'd argue, to win elections. But in doing so, I think they've actually cost democracy quite dearly.
Gerry, I've read some academics suggesting that, in fact, the democratic deficit isn't to do with the people, but it's actually the way the system's structured to make it impossible for citizens to have a role, perhaps, or at least the role that they might want. What do you think about that concept?
I think that's it's. I think probably what we should do is stop talking about citizens as if they're a whole category and politicians as if they're a whole category, but let's deal with the citizens bit of it. I think that the evidence we have is that there are probably a relatively small group of people, perhaps 5% of the population, who are genuinely committed to activism and engagement on a significant level. And for them, the blockages in the system might actually be the thing that's actually most driving their annoyance. There might be others who you might regard as kind of critical citizens who are very interested in politics and perhaps find the challenges of getting involved a little bit difficult for them. But actually, I think they're, again, a relatively small proportion of the overall population. I actually think that large numbers of people are more disappointed that representative politics just hasn't worked the way that they hoped. They don't particularly want to be wildly active themselves. They don't particularly want to take a lot of decisions themselves. They've got lots of other things to do with their lives. What they don't like is what they see as a political system which seems to be unable to address the key issues that they care about and remarkably unresponsive to what they regard as a kind of common sense understanding of the way in which decisions should be made.
It's a really interesting perspective on it. Thanks for that. So, declining levels of trust in our politicians and system of democracy are often mentioned. What does the research you've done, both in Australia and other parts of the world, tell you about this declining trust? Is it different in different parts of the world, different age groups, different demographics?
That's a very good question. I'll try and give a short answer to what is actually quite a complicated question. So, in the case of Australia, the most recent work that we've done with the Museum of Australian Democracy has shown that trust, as measured by the survey that we undertook in the early part of 2016, is at an all-time low within Australia. And that's trust in both federal government and state levels of government. There's slightly more trust in levels of local government. And because a version of a trust question has been asked in the Australian election study over at least the last 2 decades, possibly stretching into 3 decades, then what we're able to say is that at this point we're actually at a low ebb. In terms of the demographics of that trust, actually I think what we found in Australia's case, somewhat to our surprise, which is the scale of distrust was higher amongst the older members of the population rather than the younger members of the population. That is, on our measure of trust, people over 60 plus are actually more distrusting than people who are between 18 and 24, 25. But the truth is, virtually everyone is pretty distrusting of the system. In terms of other distinctions across the demographics, those who are relatively recent immigrants to Australia, they're slightly more trusting. There's no distinctive difference between regions that we could identify within Australia itself, and there's not much of the way of a gender difference either. There's a little bit of an educational difference in that those with slightly higher education tend to be slightly more trusting. But I think we can say that lack of trust is a significant issue in Australia, and that it's now very widespread and is at a high point, if you can have lack of trust at a high point. And the other thing that we did in our analysis is turn the issue around. So what I've just done is describe some of the factors that might be driving lack of trust. But what we also asked was whether lack of trust undermined your confidence in the ability of government to undertake various policy measures. And that's, I think, for us, the key factor here, which is if lack of trust means that people don't trust government, it makes it more difficult for government to actually do more complex things. And our survey showed that on national security, then the majority of the population were prepared to say that they trusted the government. On other issues, there were some senses of confidence that the government could deliver on various policies, but on many policy issues, and especially those that are more complex and challenging, then the level of trust or confidence in the ability of government to do it, to take the right action, is actually quite low.
And I think you've done similar research, maybe not exactly the same in the UK. Were the findings similar there?
Yes. So in a way, there's actually been even more detailed work done in the UK and in the US and in some European countries. And what those show, certainly both in the UK and the US, is a steady decline in levels of trust over the last 3 or 4 decades, matching the pattern in Australia to a large degree. What you find is that levels of trust do tend to go up and down a little bit. So even if a government comes newly in and it seems to have a new platform, then people seem to have a capacity to give it the benefit of the doubt. So kind of trust can go slightly up at that point, and then after a short period of time, it seems to then head back downward again. And I think one of the interesting pieces of work that we've been able to do in Britain, but this is specifically because we had access to a particular data source, which is that in Britain, the government, or rather a government agency, started to ask people in the 1930s. It was the beginning, I suppose, of large-scale social science research. Its name is mass observation. They began to ask people to write essays or commentaries on the society that they lived in. And that gives you a data source of up to 5,000 or 6,000 people writing essays about what they think about various aspects of British society stretching back to the late 1930s. And what we've been able to do, because that material is now all available in a digital form, is look at the different narratives that people had about politics in the 40s compared to the 21st century. And what you can see is people were far from rosy in their opinions about politics and politicians in the 1940s, but they have become considerably more negative and perhaps even more kind of trenchant in their criticisms of politics in the 21st century. So I think almost all the indicators that we can look at suggest that in those democracies there's been an overall decline. I think in other democracies, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, and so on, there's actually much less evidence of a decline. And in the case of Germany, again, I think you could see much less evidence of decline. In other countries, what you've seen is decline occur particularly in the light of austerity. So whereas the decline has been quite steady in Australia, Britain, and the US, in countries such as Portugal or Spain, there was actually kind of quite a lot of confidence, because those were countries that had actually experienced democracy for the first time after long periods of dictatorship. So during the 80s and 90s, they were quite confident. But when the austerity measures started to hit after the financial crisis of 2007-8, then you saw a really strong decline in levels of confidence and trust in politics and in government in those countries. So the patterns vary. It's not a universal decline across all contemporary democracies, but the overall picture is certainly one of things moving more negatively in a significant number of countries.
Can you explain what stealth democracy is and how it might relate to the surge in populism we're seeing around the world at the moment?
Yes, that refers, I think, quite well to the commentary that I made, that many people have a quite simplistic understanding of the way the political system could work. And 2 American authors were keen to explore the way that American citizens actually understood their democracy, asked a series of questions about what ideally people would like their democracy to be like. And the kinds of questions they asked were, politicians talk too much, they should take more effective action, we should use experts to make decisions rather than worry too much about political engagement. And they developed a thesis that at least a significant proportion, I think they thought maybe about 40% of Americans, had what they called a stealth understanding of democracy. Now, why did they use the word stealth? Because they were kind of making a comment about how people like to imagine that the political system acted kind of invisibly behind them, that it just kind of acted in their interest without them having to pay a great deal of attention, without them having to make a great deal of effort. And what they argued was that there was this significant proportion of people that thought, actually, it's obvious what you should do because everyone that they knew thought exactly the same as they did, and they thought, well, it was clear what politicians should do, so if the political system wasn't delivering, then that was down to corruption, to vested interests, to groups of people who'd corrupted the system in some kind of way. And that, I think, is the classic opening for a populist, which is what a populist says is, we the people, we're all clear about what should be done. We know what the problems are confronting our society. We know what action should be taken. It's just the corrupt political elite in partnership with some outside groups that are preventing the right policies being adopted. And what the populist leader does is say, if you vote for me, then I'll make sure that those policies are delivered. So the thinking behind it, I think, is very much the kind of background to what has been part of the populist surge in the United States. You can almost read Donald Trump's speeches and see the reflections of the ideas of stealth democracy.
I wonder if he's read the book. So have you done any research, or are you...
I'm not sure he's a great reader of books.
No. Have you done any research, or are you aware of any research, say in Australia or the UK, that suggests that there's a similar sized group of people in those countries that also support the concept of stealth democracy?
Well, indeed, yes, I can, because I, with colleagues, have replicated the same questions in the UK and also in Australia. And what we found was that there were indeed very similar levels of stealth attitudes within Australia and also within Britain. Other people have done the work in Holland and in Spain, and I recently read an article which did the same sets of questions in Canada, and there's one other study in Finland. The Finns were definitely the lowest in terms of the stealth democracy, but the Canadians were at a similar level to the Australians, the Brits and the Americans, and the Dutch were slightly below, but they were quite close too. And the Spanish, I forgot whether I mentioned them, they're another one where it's been done too, and they had quite high levels of stealth democracy understandings too. So I think that you can find this kind of, why doesn't the political system just get on and do what it's obvious we all want it to do, kinds of attitudes quite commonly in contemporary democracies.
My second guest is Professor Mark Warren, who I spoke to in episode 2.7 about his problem-based approach to democratic theory. In today's episode, he talks about the lack of trust being the foundation of democracy. Mark is the Harold and Dory Merrilees Chair in the Study of Democracy in the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia, where he established the Centre for the Study of Democratic Institutions. His current research interests fall within the field of democratic theory. He is especially interested in new forms of citizen participation, new forms of democratic representation, the relationship between civil society and democratic governance, and the corruption of democratic relationships. Trust, or I suppose more accurately lack of trust, in democracy is often raised as a key challenge at the moment. How do you see this issue playing out, and what can be done to address it?
Trust, as you know, in political institutions specifically and government more generally has been flatlining or declining in all of the developed democracies over the last couple of decades. The concern is that if people don't trust their collective capacities, right, their collective agents, their governments, then it's very hard for governments to represent people and to provide for people all of the things that democratic governments should be providing. Securities, protections, rights, welfare, education, health, and so on. And so the trust question is very closely linked to that collective capacity question. If we take a step back, democracies were actually born out of distrust of political elites. And mostly democracy is about building devices and institutions that align the interests of the people with the interests of elites. And democracies tend to work if people are somewhat distrustful of that alignment, so that they are constantly checking to see whether elites are actually serving them or not. And then using, protest votes, resistance, and so on and so forth to express their distrust, to remove untrustworthy elites, and to insert elites that are more trustworthy. But if a democratic system is working well, it should be able to settle the distrust. That is, if the mechanisms of interest alignment are working, then one of the results of that should be more and more trustworthy outcomes, more and more trustworthy agencies and ministries and other collective agents of the people. So I think this formula probably is still relevant. If we want more trust in government, which we need if we're going to do things for ourselves, then we need more democracy. And we need more democracy because the basics of trust are still mostly about interest alignment, mechanisms that induce elites to align their interests and careers with the interests and well-being of the people. So if you want trust, you work on democracy, I guess is what I would say.
From your perspective, what part does lack of trust play in the concept of the democratic deficit?
I think that lack of trust reflects a democratic deficit. If you are not able to use the democratic tools that you have, or believe that you can't use those tools to enforce an interest alignment between, me and my government, or us and our government, then you will not think that democracy or the tools of democracy that you have is very effective, and you won't trust the outcomes of those tools. So I think that the democratic deficit and the trust deficit are probably two sides of the same coin, more or less.
Something that I've asked other people and raised is this issue of to what extent the design of representative democracy has the deficit built into it structurally, I guess. And I think that feeds back to your problem-based approach, being that we can't actually rely on electoral democracy to deliver everything we want from democracy.
Yes, I think that's right. Elections put into place and remove governments. But in functioning democratic political systems, you have a lot more that needs to go on, a lot more that needs to get done. You need agencies and ministries that are, unlike the political branches of government, they need to be inclusive and impartial. They need to be answering to the public good rather than attending to a party platform. And this is not new. This has always been the case. And it's part of the reason that every functioning democratic system separates the political branches of government, legislatures, and the political parts of presidencies and so on, from things like ministries and executive agencies and judicial systems and other organs of government that, were they to become politicized by elections, would no longer be able to serve the public good, act impartially, and do the other kinds of things, the other sort of fully inclusive kinds of things that we expect of democratic governments.
And finally, I talk with Professor Leonardo Morlino about trust in democracy and the possibility of global democracy. Professor Morlino was part of episode 2.3 explaining his analytical approach to evaluating democracy. Leonardo is a professor of political science and director of the Research Centre on Democracies and Democratisation at LUISS in Rome. Professor Morlino is a leading specialist in comparative politics with expertise in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the phenomenon of democratisation.
Around the world, there's evidence of declining levels of trust by citizens in the operation of their governments, and yet there remains a reasonably high level of support for democracy as a system. How would you explain this apparent contradiction?
In some area, we go on betting on the democratic system because we don't have, our culture is no longer likely in condition of considering alternatives, particularly in less and less, to tell the truth. But anyway, in our collective memories, there are the failures, the terrible failures of the World War II, the terrible failures of the communism, the terrible failures of Nazism, the terrible failures of fascism, but also in a lot of cases, the terrible failure of a military regime. Think about the collective memory in Argentina about the desaparecidos. Think about the collective memory in Chile about the period of Pinochet. Of course, if we stay in Latin America, we should recognize the economic successes of the Brazilian military. And in fact, there the transition was ironically the transition to democracy was ironically the result of their success. Anyway, we learn again out of our failure, and if we consider, we still have in mind these failures, then we don't see alternative to democracy in some areas. In some other areas, is not. If you consider Russia, if you consider, say, some of the countries around close to Russia, such as even Georgia, Armenia, or Azerbaijan, other countries, there they see alternatives. They see a strong leader, they see a limited attention to the rule and try to be more effective in terms of economic result and so on. So in those countries, you see much less this support for democracy as a set of institutions. But in other countries with different collective histories, there is no alternative democracy. This is at very end, say, bottom line, the basic reason why we see the support for the system. At the same time, we go on asking more from the democratic institution that the democratic institution can actually deliver. In front of the process of globalization, democracy can do very, very little. Democracy is very much related, say, anchored to the nation state. So this kind of phenomena, this kind of global phenomena in terms of economic transformation and so on, they can say affect the countries, they affect the economic structure, and democracy as the democratic leaders have a very limited power. Of course, the phenomenon that we see now is a sort of attempt of regaining the sovereignty, of regaining this kind of territoriality of democracy. And what Trump is doing in the US is part of this story. what this kind of new trend in terms of nationalism, rightist movements goes precisely in this direction. But this again is fighting against phenomena that can be stopped for a while, but I think are part of the future development of the mankind.
Is your view that it's not possible to move democracy beyond the nation state to a more global level?
This is a specific issue that we have been addressing in these years for European Union. It is European Union as a supranational identity. Can we move democracy beyond, say, the nation state, Italy, France, Poland? The Brexit said no. That is the reaction of the citizens, and the reaction of leaders is in the trend, in the direction of re-anchoring democracy to the nation state. Of course, we can think about a new, say, federal situation, a development in terms of federalism. This is what is the most known path that we have in our, say, repertoire, in our possible political repertoire. But even this limited, more moderate path, that is go in a federal direction, as we have been seeing when looking at the European Union, is very difficult to be carried out. It's very difficult to be realized. So again, probably in the future we can see this kind of development, but it's not easy. It's not easy, above all, when there is a resistance of the leader of each country to give in their power, give in their possibility of decision making.
Yes.
So this is the kind of sort of a struggle. Of course, within, and this is probably the key point to stress now, within a situation of economic growth, could be easier to go in the direction of federalization, say, of the European Union. Within a situation of economic crisis, and in these 10 years, we were within economic crisis to greater extent or to lesser extent, is much more difficult. The sort of re-anchoring and the sort of re-territorialization of democracy that I was mentioning is one of the consequences of the economic crisis of these years.
Thanks for joining me today. In the next episode of Real Democracy Now! A podcast, I will continue to look at the democratic deficit, this time from a structural perspective. I hope you'll join me then.
Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.